The next online we have the topic changing profile of data protection laws outside India. And for that, we have V. Rajesh Kumar, Senior Group Manager, Privacy and Data Protection Office, Infosys, T. Andrea, Aditya Birla, Hanover, Aparna Pathak, TCS, and Shireen Hubber, UPS. We welcome you all for the session and would like to give you a brief introduction of Mr. Rajesh Kumar before we start the session. Rajesh is currently in role of Senior Group Manager, Privacy and Data Protection Office at Infosys. Rajesh is a law graduate by profession and also certified in field of privacy and information security. He's also founder of Bangalore Knowledge Net chapter, IAP in India. Rajesh also holds positions in IAP and even volunteer Data Security Council of India, Bangalore chapter, ISACA, and ICFC Bangalore chapter. We welcome you, Rajesh, today. And over to you. The floor is over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sanyogita. Thanks. So thank you very much, Sanyogita. So I would like to take this opportunity first to thank FTPPI and all the key members, including Mr. Navis in special, for giving me this opportunity. So I would like to call upon for this particular topic, which is basically a changing legal paradigm which we see or which we witness outside of India, where with the evolution of GDPR, there are many legislations that are coming in across many countries, which have a very series of legislations that have been tried. Some mirror the GDPR, but there are many such legislations which are quite contradictory and quite much more keeping in pace with the current technological evolution. We see legislations coming in. So with this, before getting into much into detail in the context, without any further ado, I would like to call upon Andrea Tiedemann. She is the HR EMEA Director for Europe, Middle East, and Africa for Birla Carbon. And she is also the Global Data Protection Officer for Birla Carbon and also have been responsible for leading the GDPR program at Birla. Next, I would like to call upon Ms. Aparna Pathak, who is the Global Privacy Specialist. And Aparna is a Global Data Privacy Specialist working as part of TCS. She's also certified with CIPPE and CIPM and also a fellow informational privacy professional. And Aparna strongly believes in embracing the privacy culture and building trust among the stakeholders for all organizations. Next, I would like to call upon Shireen Hubber, who is a Director of Data Privacy for UPS. She's been with UPS since 2007 and now serves as the legal support of all privacy-related topics. She also works on data transfers and vendor contracts, mainly EU cloud-based contracts, vendors, and she also advises senior management on privacy topics in Germany. I would also like to call upon Alexander Duisberg, who is a partner of Bird & Bird. He's a fourth panel member. And Dr. Alexander covers tech-related and commercial matters in his business role. He specializes in digital transformation projects, data-driven business models, including transactional data protection, cybersecurity, and AI. He also works on various government committees, which helps in shaping the legal framework for the future and an in-depth experience in the domestic and international arbitration of technology disputes. So we welcome all the panel members, and we look forward to have valuable insights on the particular topic, which we may encompass trying to cover not just the European region, but also many legislations across the globe. So with this, so to set the context on the topic, what we potentially see, we had the Europeans, which had always set the baselines of a very stringent data protection regulations. And there were many other countries in Asia Pacific had its own model where they were trying to make sure that the legislations, starting from the Hong Kong Ordinance to the Singapore Data Privacy Act, where they try to make serious commitments towards monitoring and enforcement of obligations towards any such data processing, But however, you did see a lot of gaps. And the same was also witnessed when Europe had its own EU-based directive, which specifically in terms had its own challenges. A more sectoral basis, which was taking care of the sectoral needs, at the same time giving more priority from a security posture, so that the what we look at it from in terms of compliance, I mean, if you look at the FTC practice, I mean, FTC had a very serious practice of ensuring that any such abusive practices, it was bringing it within suo moto in its own jurisdiction, and making sure that the data subjects or the individuals, their informations are not misused or mistreated. So privacy was also part and parcel of that. Then we had the GDPR coming into picture. GDPR came at the right time. It took a longer conversations way back from 2012 to 2016, and it had a 2 years of transition time. But with 4.5 years down the line, we still see GDPR as, for many privacy professionals, it has become like a new commandments, which was laying out its own set of contexts and interpretations outside for the businesses and for the professionals to follow. But however, whether it is in keeping in pace with the technology, and what are those concerns that still continue to emanate, which has its own different interpretations, is something that we will try to cover. So in this particular context, we will have a discussion with the key panel members down here on some of the very significant topics of developments that really have been one of the need of the hour whenever a legislation is being framed, to consider these additional areas. And these are some of the biggest requirements that we feel in many legislations, we do see gaps, which includes even from a GDPR perspective. And we see many subsequent legislations coming into picture. And we also see US trying to adopt the EU-based model, and also trying to make sure that the central and the state level regulations meet the expectations of the end individuals. So with this, some of the topics are artificial intelligence, cross-border, privacy by design. And I do understand we also had the role of the data protection officer, which was also briefly described by the previous speaker. And we'll also talk about data breach notification and consent. So with this context laid, I would like to take forward the discussion. My first question, probably Sharon, is towards you. I mean, see, now today we look at from an artificial intelligence today, that which was considered a myth in the past is now the change. It is now that's the need of the hour, where artificial intelligence, automations, machine learning are the future. Keeping in mind, we do understand there is an emanation of principles like OECD, which is the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, had its own privacy principles laid down to make sure we have responsible AI. And going in the same march with the Europeans' data policy, we also saw a draft framework of regulation that was published by the European Commission, which is on the EEA regulatory framework. This was to ensure to adopt and balance innovation and accountabilities. So before we getting deep into the context, I would like, for the purpose of this audience, if you can provide a little bit of a short glimpse of what the OECD principles are and how EU regulatory framework on AI and OECD share a mutual value.
Thanks a lot for the question. Can you hear me properly?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, AI is not new, right? It's there since quite a time. And I mean, if you think of, for example, Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz, which does not have a heart and still is able to react. I mean, it's not new, but of course it had accelerated. The development is a complete new stage in the past years. And maybe you mentioned already, Rajesh, the new legislation, the draft legislation for the Artificial Intelligence Act. Maybe let me start with that to give the audience a glimpse of what that really means and what the key components are. So it's one of a bunch of legislative acts and steps from the European Commission, which is part of Europe's digital agenda. And there, the aim is to foster and to promote the digital services across Europe. This agenda started, as you rightly said, I mean, long time ago, and we have seen with GDPR and also e-privacy, the first part of this evolution, if you want to call it like that. And now it has continued not only with the regulation, and for the sake of this panic here, let's call it the AI Act, but please let's understand that this is a draft for a regulation becoming act in the national member states directly without a transition once it has been finalized. And the AI Act is not the only one. There is also the Digital Service Act. There is the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, the Data Governance Act, and the Data Act. And I do know that we do not have the time to go into these, but if you are, if you market something on the European market, if you target the European market, it's really wise to get familiar with all of these acts because they might affect you, at least some of them. So to come back to the AI Act, it wants to ensure that all artificial intelligence systems and all techniques that come together in artificial intelligence are safe and respect existing laws of the union, and also to respect union values. It tries to enhance the governance, and it wants again to facilitate the development of a single market in the digital area. In terms of scope, it will not only apply to AI developed in Europe, it will directly, or it will also apply to all AI systems which have an output on the European market. So that, again, if you target the European market, it's pretty likely that you are in scope. Now, what the law does, or what the draft law does, is it assigns AI systems and techniques into 3 risk categories. One is the first one is the unacceptable risk, and that is where the draft law just says it will be prohibited. Some examples here are real-time identification systems, all forms of social profiling, then any manipulative technique that can pose a harm to an individual. On the other end of the road, we have the low risk or minimal risk AI systems, which is kind of AI-enabled games, right? The chatbots that we all are familiar with. And then the big part of the draft law is the so-called high-risk AI systems. And here you really see that is where the focus of the legislator is, and where they want to get their regulatory arms around it, if you want so. We are talking here about systems that evaluate customer credit scoring in the employment context, the management and the recruiting AI techniques that we see already on the market. Systems used for, or systems using biometric and facial recognition, all AI that is used in the critical infrastructure, which can have an impact on life and health, and then any system that is used in law enforcement. And you are, as you rightly said, there are already, when you hear of what is in scope, there you think of the GDPR principles and the OECD principles. Now, let me first highlight, because that I think gives you an idea of how the two will work together, the key obligations if you fall in such a high risk category. So you have risk management obligations. You need to have a process or processes in place to identify and evaluate and mitigate any potential risk throughout the whole life cycle of your AI. There are data governance obligations that, I mean, you must meet high quality standards. And the training, validation, and testing must be relevant and then representative, free of errors, and complete, which might already be a conflict in AI, right? Because I mean, it is a developing software by its nature. You do have documentation obligations, and you also have transparency obligations, and all of your AI applications must be subject to human oversight, which also can overrule what your AI system mechanism does. And then last but not least, you need to ensure that it's robust and secure. And then you have the OECD principles, which are reflected in GDPR, like the collection limitation. So according to the OECD principles, you have your purpose and you only collect what you need to meet this purpose. Now, if you want to have AI to flourish, to work, to foster, that might be a conflict per se. The next one is data quality. I think the aim of the European Commission, and if you read through the law, they had that in mind. And so that is kind of what I feel through all of the OECD principles. According to the lawmakers, there is no conflict, but do they know how it works in practice? That might be a complete different story. So data quality, I think they go in concert, the OECD principles and the draft law, because the expectation is that you meet these high quality standards only with accurate data, only with accurate outcomes of an AI. And again, will that really meet reality? That I think will be seen and definitely need to be responded by some technical guys. But I think that is where the legislative sector needs really education here. Then individual participation, I think there is not so much on the AI Act, but you need to see that as one of the laws in concert with others. And for example, the Data Act will provide users with the access to their data also generated by AI. And that is, so I think here you do not have a conflict, again, according to the law, according to the rules. How a company will, however, ensure and enable such access is really challenging, I think, because you do not have just one set of data. You do not have, it also comes together with what is personal data, what is non-personal data. And all of a sudden you need to reveal your processes and think now also of non-personal data. So again, here, good intent by the lawmakers. Practicability, I think I would put it with a question mark. Purpose specification, sure, that is what you should have. Use limitation, again, maybe not doable just by the nature of AI, by the nature of machine learning. Security safeguards and openness, yes. And then we come to the big point of accountability. You do not have just one party behind the AI. You have the manufacturer, you have the people who train the AI, you have the users, and then you have the data subjects. And so the big question, I think, will definitely also be who is liable. The draft law expects liability from all of the stakeholders, period. I think we will see in future also some cases where it will bring us to court because it might not be easily resolvable in a day-to-day business. I think I pause here.
Thank you. Thank you, Shirin. I mean, as much as the topic of AI is definitely complex, but it is simpler for businesses because businesses wants to adopt it, and that's where the market is going on. But I think the more challenges is for the privacy professionals to align with these expectations, the practicality. You touched it on the right note. Since I don't see Aparna here, but so probably Alexander, just wanted your guidance. I mean, we have had these discussions many times also in the past. Just from your perspective of view, the practicality when we look at these laws and making sure that the innovation from one end is balanced with the compliance. How essentially you see that organizations today, when they adopt everything on a risk-based approach, how it can be read? Can compliance be a risk-based approach? What is the best way that a law can help in making sure to provide the right guidance from a legislation standpoint, so that it doesn't lead to a multiple interpretation? For example, being transparent and providing the algorithms. I'm sure many businesses would not be happy because there are intellectual property and other issues revolving around it. So any inputs from your end?
Yeah, well, thanks, Raj. Yes, it's a very complex topic because I think, in difference to what has been the past experience for many of us, we're now really moving or operating in a moving target environment as regards upcoming regulations. So I think all of us have experienced, at least those in Europe and those affected by the GDPR. This has been obviously a major overhaul in how organizations need to organize themselves around, data and how they find out how they have organized themselves in the past around data. That has worked quite well, I would say, for a larger majority of the corporations by instituting, obviously, the data protection officer as required or to the extent required, and building that into the overall corporate governance structure. Interestingly enough, of course, the data protection officer is a figure which stems from Germany. We had it in our previous pre-GDPR legislation. So we've actually had, if you like, blueprint experience that has then emanated into the wider GDPR remit. Maybe on a practical level, taking that as an example, we've already had a market that developed with, the appointment of internal or external DPOs, which is one way that organizations have been able to deal with that requirement, taking external service providers as an alternative to the internal appointment, then relying obviously on a service agreement with the external compliance function, and thereby also managing risk to a certain degree. But if we look at it more widely, I think the whole topic of data is not limited, of course, to GDPR, but it also implies, we see it for many corporations, that it's been the stepping stone to find out how they deal with data. And some have used that as a groundwork then to build the wider ecosystem of managing data. And we can see that all of this upcoming legislation, including the AI Act, including very much the Data Act, are designing, and obviously they're not yet in effect, but they are designing a role for the, let's say, data holder or the responsible entities running AI systems to be very conscious about how they deal with data, what they do with it, how does it impact the organization, how does it impact data subjects. And we see different, let's say, levels of granularity playing out, but for sure we see a great organizational requirement. So how to manage that, how to strike the balance between innovation and compliance and risk management is something that depends very much on the culture and the appetite of an organization towards innovation. And I think all of us need to appreciate standing still is not the way forward. A final remark. We do see that many corporations do get quite active and involved in helping shape the lawmaking process. So also that part, what you traditionally might call lobbying, has been very engaged. And in Europe, it works obviously a lot through the trade associations to be vocal and engaged in that sphere. We find, and that's maybe the conclusion here, the regulators, including the EU Commission, are seeing a need. They are listening to the variety of stakeholders, and what Shirin also observed, sometimes we see that it might be the European approach to things. We tend to overregulate, or we think we need to create a perfect system to create that level of reliability, and that imposes significant burdens on business. So I think it will take some time until we enter into corrective measures to kind of slow down. But right now, the train is rolling towards these regulations.
Interesting point. I think coincidentally the flow is perfect. So thanks for that insight, Alexander. So it comes to Andrea. So, Alexander was talking about the data role of a data protection officer. So today you have many legislations which has its own way of approach. We have organizations which is not present in only one local country. We have multiple presence. We are multinational global organizations. So the concept of group data protection officer versus the local data protection officer, And in addition to that, we also see some legislations like in Philippines, where we talk about addition to a global DPO, you also identify a COP, which is a compliance officer on privacy. That is also getting emanating. And we are also seeing service providers. Now, with all these roles and responsibilities, which is setting forth accountability, there's always this conflict, not between a CISO and an DPO, which is way far. I mean, I'm talking about the multi-personality that an individual may have to serve, being a DPO or a CPO, to an organization. So what are your valuable insights, and what are those best practices that a country can adopt when, framing a legislation, so which can give a clear, direct guidance in terms of setting out what should be the way this accountability can be aligned to? Your thoughts, Andrea?
Yes, thanks for this question, Rajesh. I mean, you're absolutely right that there are a lot of different rules throughout the world. So just as an example, although most people may think that all countries which are members of the European Union have the same rules, since the GDPR is a European regulation, this is still not correct. I mean, each country had to implement its own data privacy law, which of course needs to be compliant with the GDPR. However, the rules are very much different in the different countries. And this is obviously the same all over the world. So most governments have an increased awareness of data privacy, so that many new legislations have been implemented or are on their way, actually. From what we see, most countries did not look at best practices in other countries, but adopted just what they thought is best. And this leads, as what was already mentioned before, to a huge workload for multinational companies and also to some confusion. And as you already mentioned in your statement, in some countries, you can have a group data protection officer. In other countries, it's mandatory to appoint a local data protection officer, or in some cases, the managing director is automatically the one who is responsible for data protection. And just to explain shortly what we do in Birla Carbon, so we appointed a global data protection officer once the European GDPR was on its way. We are of the opinion that the European GDPR is a very complex and detailed legislation, as Alex also mentioned already. And we assume that if we are compliant with this law, we'll be compliant in other countries as well. However, to be sure, we also introduced a global data privacy team consisting of global data protection officer, legal, and IT. We also have a global law firm working with us so that we are aware of any new jurisdiction which will come up anywhere in the world. So this law firm also helps us to understand changes and court decisions better and ensures that our policies are compliant. We set up global data protection policies, which are quite general, so that they will fit to different legislations. Of course, there's a downside to that, and this is that in many cases we need to set up local policies as well. So we are currently experiencing this in Brazil, for example, since this is mandatory in some of those countries. What we also did was we then appointed a local data privacy champion or local data protection officer in each of our locations. And those are actually employees who usually do data protection in addition to their daily jobs. They can ensure that we do not miss any possible complaint or challenge, and they will come up with questions or concerns so that we can discuss and take action. In many cases, the local data privacy champions are HR employees, since they already have a good understanding of the local laws and also handle sensitive data in their HR jobs already. Regarding the different jurisdictions with respect to global or local DPOs, since there are always local questions coming up, I would personally always recommend to appoint one global DPO plus a local DPO or champion, no matter if this is mandatory by law or not. The challenge, of course, is to make all colleagues aware that data protection is key nowadays and to provide them with the support they need. I mean, imagine the workload of a managing director. Data protection will not always be his or her first priority to look at in daily life. But coming back to your question on what countries could do to make compliance easy and less burdensome with respect to the appointment of data protection officers, I believe that many countries do not really differentiate enough between small local companies and global players. So global players will usually have sufficient resources to monitor different legislations all over the world. This means in consequence that from a compliance point of view, it should be okay to have a group DPO who is accountable. I would even say that most likely a group DPO will have a deeper knowledge regarding data protection than the local head of the entity, due to the different tasks that a local entity head will have. What countries in general could do better is to be more aligned with others, I think. So the European GDPR, as was already mentioned before, was a good start. But as always in the European Union, the European regulations must be translated into local legislation, which very often results in different ways to deal with this. And I really had to smile when Alex was talking about how strict we are in Europe very often and how over-regulating we are. And I think this is especially the case for Germany. Everybody will agree on that who knows the German way. What I think would be a good addition as well is to look at other compliance standards which are linked to quality and management systems like the AITF or ISO. There is already, I mean, as all of you most likely know, there is already a data protection certification called ISO 27701. Of course, those certifications are not introduced by the countries itself, but they are widely accepted throughout the world. So it could be worthwhile for lawgivers to look at those and to check if a company which has been certified by such standards on a yearly basis would be seen as compliant by default. I mean, we have a global economy and we should make it easier for multinational companies to comply with the different jurisdictions. We are all willing to comply and we see the need for data protection and data privacy. But what makes our life difficult are the different and very detailed jurisdictions all over the world, and especially the different interpretations and court decisions, which can blow up what you thought was a good decision in the very start. I hope this answers your question a bit, Rajesh.
Rajesh, you are on mute. Rajesh, you're on mute.
Oh, okay. Sorry. That really sums up the questions, the question. But however, I just wanted to ask, this is one of my debateful topics, which I always have even with my manager. This is on the role of a DPO and a CPO. So when Alex, Sherin, Andrea, please pitch in, because it's a very conflicting role, right? So, and as laws are becoming tougher, as we are seeing technology evolving, the role that the person may play, provided, especially if a person is internal, and the person is also part of ISG, information security team, or for part of the legal, or sometimes we also see it, certain other functions also runs this particular role. So what are those challenges that may come in? So typically when a provision like the position of data protection officer is clearly defined in a legislation, we are seeing laws clearly depicting the role, even within the GDPR 37 and 38 clearly showcase that. So what do you potentially see? What are those things that we need to make sure that this distinction is quite clear? Because in the European context, a DPO is an agent to the authority. He has a dotted reporting line to the authority, whereas a CPO is a full direct reporting to the organization. Some touch base on that. I know this is a very hot topic, but it's something which needs more clarity, and still we have not seen it much in GDPR till date. So Alex, over to you first.
Yes, so very good point. So actually, the role of the data protection officer under the GDPR is designed to be independent in its judgment and also in its resourcing, have the level of resources so that it can take or fulfill its role in an independent manner. So it shall not be in a direct reporting line subject to instructions of management. At the same time, the DPO has no own discretionary decision powers within the organization. So it is essentially something like an advisory role. And interestingly enough, you mentioned the point, is it a direct report to the authorities? That plays out differently in the European jurisdictions. So in France, with the CNIL, that is very much the case. In Germany, it is not so much the case. Only exceptionally in data breach situations, it would be the immediate contact if needed, but otherwise not necessarily. We see it very difficult sometimes, speaking more widely, to embed the DPO into the compliance organization where we see sometimes very delicate balances to strike in the policy framework of how to ensure the independence, but at the same time also make sure the DPO marches along in the overall direction embedded to the strategy of the organization. And sometimes we also see unfortunate situations where the level of, let's say, resilience on the DPO side is very, very strong. And it can also turn out to be cumbersome for the business, which is then the situation where management then typically relies then either on external advice or on the legal department, and finds itself in the difficult position not to overrule advice of the DPO, but actually take a risk which might go further than what the DPO in its conservative approach is trying not to prevent, but it was trying to caution. So it is a very, very complicated situation very often, and even to the extent sometimes DPOs, maybe for traditional reasons, do not adequately fulfill their role, and then it's the question, can you replace them? And that's very difficult as well. So many struggles, whereas if you say the CPO might be more a direct report to the management, then yes, that comes more with an executional role. We see it as a difficult situation, and sometimes organizations to a certain degree then do rely on external sources, but that also doesn't always solve the problem, because the insight into the organization is pivotal for a DPO to fulfill its role. He or she has to have access to the relevant information. So the role of the DPO is good. It is a self-regulatory institutional role, but in practical terms, it is not easy to manage and maintain. And we do, obviously, as legal advisor, we see the problematic situations more than the others. But it is something that continues to be a point of, let's say, care that management needs to apply.
Thank you, Alex. Shirin, you want to add on anything to that, or you feel Alex has totally covered it?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, we also, I think, like Andrea, we have the same network. I mean, we have one global DPO. I do think that you can't just have one person meeting all of the requirements, right? I mean, that's just not impossible. It's just not possible. So we also work with a team who supports the global privacy officer, and for us, it's currently separated. So we do have the global privacy officer under the legal function, and we do have a separate compliance function. I think the charming part of that is that the advice the global privacy officer and the global privacy team gives can be audited internally. So when you think of the PIAs, the privacy impact assessments, where your business tells you what they want to achieve, you give the advice, you evaluate the risks, you try to mitigate the risks. We give some remediation steps, and I mean, it's up to the business whether or not they take it, but it's a documenting piece. They need to document, and that gives or paves the way for our audit team to randomly check and then audit what the global privacy team has recommended.
Great, thank you. The next topic is much interest, and I think that's one thing which keeps the privacy professionals at bay. This is the topic on cross-border data transfers. I mean, first of all, when we look at it, there's a difference between data localization and cross-border transfers. Sometimes both these terms are interchangeably used, and that arises the complexity in many cases. Now, but today we will just try to look at from a cross-border data transfer perspective. So, as regulations are being drafted, I think either we see many cases like Dubai or Popia, many such cases where we see they're totally falling back on the GDPR methodology that has been defined. But there are certain legislations which have if you look at Turkey law, or if you look at the Brazil LGPD, transfers do have mechanisms of adequacy, but many other aspects, the transfers are based either on consent or is it based on prior consultations in many cases. So we see there's a huge conflicting the way how businesses can operate under these kind of legislations. So Shirin, over to you. This question is more in terms of how do you see cross-border? I mean, not just from a SCRIMS2 standpoint, but I'm looking from a legislation standpoint that can really help legislations have a uniform and a harmonious way of looking at it for businesses to operate. So what is your insights, with post SCRIMS2? We're seeing a lot of importance here. So what is your insights on that?
Thanks for that question, Rajesh. I think to be very honest, it is a burden. It is a burden for everybody who does business outside of Europe, according to European perspective. The same for other countries, but I'm based in Europe and my core responsibility is in Europe, so I suffer most from the European regulation. I wish all countries had copied the GDPR. In that case, the European Commission could just go with its adequacy decisions and done deal. We all would have the real free flow of data. Like, for example, Argentina, right, who copied the Spanish law, and that's why you have the adequacy decision. I think over the past 3 decades, we have seen the data access and the sharing of data have really become central. And also not only central for the economic growth, but also essential for our all social well-being. And that is not only because of the generation of data, it's also because of the data sharing that has become so central for the economy in almost every sector. There is almost no sector where you can say data transfer is not helpful. However, I think this huge increase of data sharing also led to challenges that you have seen arising and to concerns that we have seen arising. And I think what countries and nations just right now do is to try to address these concerns, these raising concerns with their policies and with their regulations. Europe, has set its precedents with the 2 Schrems rulings in 2015 and 2020. So there was an Austrian privacy activist called Max Schrems who brought data transfers to the European Court of Justice twice. And in the 2020 decision, the European Court of Justice basically said that a data exporter and a data importer need to assess the legal scheme in the country of data destination. They need to compare it with the legal scheme prevailing or with the legal scheme in Europe. They need to identify gaps, and they also need to supplement or close these gaps by supplementary measures. So not only do you need a data transfer tool, which is a challenge as such already, but you also need to have this expertise, this legal expertise, to compliantly share your data and let your data flow. And that transfer impact assessment I have seen as a huge challenge. And although according to the law or according to the regulation and to the jurisdiction, it's something which the data importer and the data exporter need to do together, I see, still the liability is on the data controller, which is very often the data exporter, so that you do have this imbalance between the 2 parties, and then you need to, as a data exporter, as a data controller, you really need to lift up all of these legal tasks. Now, if you are a big company, if you have the resources, if you can work with outside counsel, okay, that might work. But on the other hand, what if you are a small and medium-sized company? Where do you get the resources from? Where do you get the knowledge from? That is a huge challenge. Turkey, to maybe go a bit beyond Europe. Turkey they do have their requirements. In my view, it's pretty difficult to follow. Their data transfer tools that they offered are not really robust. I have not seen any BCRs approved by the Turkish board. Undertakings, which is kind of a contractual agreement, does only work between 2 parties, 1 exporter, 1 importer. So that's also not what helps you out in a global context. Consent is another opportunity, but we all know how to handle consent and the challenges with consent, right? What if you get the consent? First of all, how do you really properly inform about it? How do you obtain the consent, and how do you handle that consent at any time without a reason can be withdrawn? So that's also a challenge here. China, I mean, is still in the process. But what we see right now, the current rules require really a step-by-step approach to navigate through the cross-border data transfer requirements. Either you fall under one of the exemptions. If not, you need to undergo a security assessment, which is not easy to do, and so forth. All in all, I think we all need to realize the data and the flow, the free flow of data is critical to the potential of all digital technologies, of all digital development, be it machine learning, be it AI, be it innovation on any other segment, right? And in this context, I think we need to maintain a high degree of trust. We need maybe to get back to and earn back the trust for data transfers, because I think what we cannot work with is this piecemeal of different data transfer tools for global companies. And in some areas, you do have the impression that what is okay on one end of the world, it's completely different on the other side. And I mean, how will you harmonize that? So I think that is the overall aim that we want to get at. I pause.
Thank you, Sherin. So one particular question, so probably Alex, the question is more directed towards the administrative aspects. So today we see many legislations coming out with their own standard contractual clauses which have been published. But if an organization has a multiple presence, or if an organization is providing a service to a client, but the presence of the data subjects and presence of the data being processed belonging to such data subjects is multiple jurisdictional. So there are very huge differences in the way the old school and new school interpretations have been revolving around. The old school is you need to have the SEC from an European context, plus you need to have, if UK data is involved, you need to have the UK ITDA executed. Then if there is Dubai, then you need to have a separate SEC. So they go in a separate documentation. Whereas the new school is all about aligning it and making it much more simpler for usage, provided not taking over the consequence of, because sometimes the client, you will also see the client says, SEC, nothing can be modified. I mean, by irrespective, today we have SEC 3-4 modules together, but even though there is a person, the engagement is using only C2P, which is the module 2, and we try to remove references of the applicability of the clauses for a module 3 and module 4, people don't feel that the change has to happen, because this old school thought they just replicate the document. The only thing that you can do is signature. So what is the best way forward? Is there some kind of a guidance? Probably, Andrea, you can also pitch in from your industry expertise that how you perform in such cases where multiple jurisdictions are involved, and what kind of documentations? Is it still content heavy, or is it something which is very simpler and it's more amenable to compliance perspective?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I might just kick off and say, obviously, it depends on the flavor of, from the legal advisor perspective, a little bit of the corporate organization and how heavy-weighted or light-handed they are open to proceed. But I think the burden that Sherin you addressed, it is noticeable, because just getting in line, I mean, getting the right modules in line is a question of advice and knowledge on the client side, of course. And yes, you then still have the issue if you're considering not only the company internal side, but the outreach side, the customer, the supplier side. You might have different forms presented, although the substantive content is always aligned. We're looking at compliance documentation, which is not subject to like commercial discussions. However, you do have that administrative burden, and it is to say that yes, the steps change for BCR is something that needs to be looked at. I think the processes have now become easier, but let's say we're still in the framework of the standard contract clauses and the data transfer agreements. It is very difficult to manage, and we should not forget that based on Schrems 2, we need to deal with the privacy impact assessments that were addressed, and they in themselves do create an additional overlay of documentation because you need to assess the legislative framework in the importer country. You wish to align that to a considerable degree. So when we run these programs for corporate clients globally, we try to, tell our, fellow colleagues to stick to the format and keep it, very much aligned, because the most difficult issue about document management is that if everything looks different, but the substance is quite aligned, then it's a nightmare for everyone. If you kind of condense it to a similar look and feel and then try to distill it and make it shorter, you do have some efficiency gains, and they can be helpful. But the substantive part, of course, the judgment call of whether or not you achieve through a privacy impact assessment the level of, let's say, protection that comes out of the EU, that is a very difficult judgment to call. And I should say, as a conclusive remark, I think I'm quite fully convinced, and I'm also reiterating that in fora where I might be involved and asked. We have had a bit of a too strong pendulum swing through the European Court of Justice, through the Schrems 2 ruling. We need to kind of bring it back. So I would say maybe as an outcome of whenever we have the new privacy framework with the US, there will be a new judgment of the European Court of Justice, the Schrems 3, and hopefully the European Court of Justice then kind of considers again and says we need to kind of stay back and step back a little bit from the extreme demands because they are too burdensome. And I think they're not doing anyone really good. So, the newer old school on documentation is, I would hope, a transitional period to something that helps all of the corporations.
Thank you. Perfect. That's really the right way to sum it up. Andrea, you want to pitch in?
Yes, I would just like to add a bit to what has already been said before. So what I experience in my daily life very often is that there is also a lack of understanding and partly a lack of support from companies who do not work in the European region. So very often they do not understand the complexness of the European GDPR and why I'm asking for all these documents or for a change in their documentation. And as Alex already said, I understand perfectly why they don't want to change their documentation. I mean, if every customer comes up and wants changes, this is a nightmare as well. On the other hand, we have our restrictions as well, and we need to comply with them. So this is really a big challenge I face almost every day. And in addition to that, the next challenge, which Alex already mentioned as well, are the privacy impact assessments. So this is very often seen as something which just needs to be signed and filed somewhere. And when we come up with additional questions, then it is very often very hard to get those additional documentations. And what happens also very often is that there is a project and the implementation deadline comes up very soon. And then somebody realizes, oh, I mean, in multinational companies, this happens very often that not everybody is very much aware of the GDPR, of PIAs in general, although we have mandatory online trainings for each and every employee. And then at some point of time, somebody comes up and says, well, what about data privacy? Did somebody do a privacy impact assessment? And then I'm involved because, I mean, I didn't know about this, for example, new software. And then everything should go very fast. And I mean, obviously, I don't want to block anybody, but I want to be sure that it's compliant, what we do there, right? And then I come up with questions, and then it's kind of pressure from both sides, I would say, because the implementation deadline comes up very soon. And those are different challenges we face, I would say, with customers, with suppliers, but also internally in the organization. And nobody wants to, or I mean, nobody's doing this on purpose. It is just because it is such a complex situation to deal with. And as Alex already said, I think in the near future, there must be a kind of ease of the legislation, because it is almost impossible, at least for smaller companies, to cope with all these requirements which we have here.
So seriously, fingers crossed on that. Hope to see that future very soon. The another area which I would probably wanted to debate it, as we have time is of essence here. So the other interesting evolution that has happened is data breach notifications. I mean, if you look at US had data breach notifications mandatory much prior to GDPR. I mean, at the same time, we also had many other countries which came up with the laws in line with the sectoral approach to have data breach notifications made mandatory. Then GDPR came in with the requirements, one reporting to the authority under 33, and then to the 34, talking in terms of providing those aspects to the, in terms of transparency per se, informing the data subjects as well. Now, but we are seeing a slight more deviations, not only with the way how this has been drafted. So today we see there are countries that are also coming up with data breach notifications, which primarily was with the controller was owning that accountability as part of it. Today we see even processors as data processor, you need to report such incidents or breaches directly to the authority, irrespective of whatever you might have agreed in the contract with your client. For example, the Philippines recently published its guidance. I mean, we also see in many other jurisdictions also of the same ask, and Australia has also come up with recently a $50 million penalty with the amendment of their data breach requirements as part of the privacy legislations. So, Alex, I want to start with you. You see a huge trend, but the practicality is again an issue. So the law is there, the businesses have to run with profits. Now the balance is to make sure it is practically be feasible. So what are your thoughts about how the way the trend is happening on the data breach notifications, and what could be the better ways to make sure that the legislation has the right kind of guidance? And is it really possible that without even letting the client know, a data processor can directly go and report? And what kind of repercussions that probably from a business standpoint, the organization can face?
Yeah, no, thanks, Raj. I think that type of legislation is actually a real problem. And I think it's a lot less well thought through from my perspective, because any controller is obviously embedded to an ecosystem of suppliers or data processors, their technical suppliers and so forth. And the idea that the processor runs out on his own and discloses information about a breach which directly affects the domain and also possibly trade secrets and levels of insecurity and so forth on the controller side really cuts into the interest of the controller. So my thinking is normally that compliance is really built around the legal obligations of the controller, and from there deriving are the obligations of the processor. So I think per se that is an issue, but obviously we need to recognize if legislation is going that way, then we need to think about how can that be kind of hedged or fostered and dealt with. And I think that the conclusion, it has to be dealt with through contractual undertakings. So I think it goes along with what we had traditionally in the common data processing agreements, that you would have an obligation of the processor to inform the controller about any data breaches which occur in the sphere of the processor, to immediately inform the controller so that the controller can comply with its notification obligations, which are obviously very timely in the EU with the 72-hour timeline. So that was an area obviously which needed to be managed very carefully, but through, let's say, the proper contractual mechanisms, by and large, has worked well. If we consider now the situation that the processor is under an own genuine obligation, I think at least we need to make sure that in the contractual agreements with the controller, there is some kind of requirement for interaction so that the controller has at least knowledge, but also possibly some influence on the content of the notification. Because yes, it does touch on the sphere of the controller, whom I would, whose interest is probably not considered otherwise under this new legislation outside of Europe.
Shirin, Andrea, please pitch in, because this is a very sensitive topic. I think in the concept of accountability, where the laws are trying to entrust the principles, they're trying to make sure that, as Alex said, all the stakeholders being given the direct responsibility, so that the rights and the harms that need to be protected under the legislation is duly protected, because probably there are a lot of organizations don't come out and publish or notify the authorities. I think this is one way of getting to make sure that the whole loop is closed. Your thoughts, Shirin. Andrea, please feel free to jump in on this particular topic. Your thoughts about it.
I mean, I agree that it's difficult, and I think we have not yet resolved the issue, because we took really a big effort in making sure that if we outsource data, if we have a data processor on board, that if something goes wrong, the first thing the processor does is to inform UPS, so that we can evaluate the case, we can decide whether or not a notification is needed or not. And we were pretty upset if it was the other way around, if the processor went ahead, already notified, maybe already naming us, and then I think you are only the second one, right, who can do the notification. So it's I think it's a conflict a bit with the accountability principle. It's a conflict that you need to overcome with a lot of education, with all impacted stakeholders. And as said, I think we haven't yet really found a practical solution for addressing that issue, because it took us so long to get where we are at the moment, to have our processes in place. And I think we are ready to do the assessment whenever there is a breach or incident notification to us, related to our data. But this cooperation piece, I think, is really key for meeting all of the obligations that are there. On the other hand, I mean, it also requires us to rethink of our contracts that we have in place, because right now, I mean, we cannot bring the third party into this odd situation of complying with our requirements, and by that violating the legal obligations that they are subject to.
Sure. Andrea, want to add something?
Yes, so to what Shirin just said, I mean, this has the potential to destroy the relationship between the different stakeholders, right? So as Shirin just said, I mean, we would be very upset as well if the other stakeholder would report an incident to the authorities while we are still doing an assessment, and maybe we conclude that it is not needed to notify the authorities. And this leads us to a real issue. So I think this is a big challenge and a big problem which has to be solved sooner or later. And we don't have a solution for that as well by now.
Great. Thank you. So there are many other interesting which we wanted to cover it, but time is always, I think this is a very quite interesting topic, many domains to cover. We wanted to also talk about privacy by design, also on workplace privacy, consent. These are some of the topics which we still don't find a proper guidance or a harmonious guidance that an organization can adopt across locations. But in the interest, as part of summing up, I would request panel members to provide a kind of a summing conclusion in terms of what are those other areas that you potentially see which may need a significant way of introspection into how it needs to be applied, taking into consideration the business, taking into consideration the innovation, and taking into also consideration the cultural aspects of a particular country. So probably, Andrea, you can start with, and then Sherin and probably Alex, if you can provide a summing conclusion on your thoughts.
Yes, sure. So, I mean, in summary, I would say that for multinational companies, it is very important, as I said in the very beginning, to have a global DPO who has general knowledge on the different jurisdictions and a general understanding of data protection. We said already as a start that most likely this cannot be one person who has a deep knowledge on everything. So therefore, it is good to have a team which would be responsible for the global approach and for the global policies, a team like the global DPO, legal, compliance, and maybe also communications. At the same time, there should be local data protection champions, because they will be the go-to persons in the different sites and they will give insights on the local requirements. So that would be one statement I wanted to give. What would also be important is to implement a kind of incident response plan. I mean, we haven't spoken about that so far. We worked very long on an incident response plan according to or in compliance with our IT department as well. One other topic would be that employees really need to be aware of the importance of data protection. So this is something where we still have a challenge. Although, as I said before, we already introduced e-learnings, which have to be done or repeated each year. But we still see that data privacy and data protection is not fully understood, I would say, by every employee in our total organization to the extent which is needed, at least in the European Union and in many other countries.
Thank you, Andrea. Sherin, over to you.
I go with all that Andrea said. In addition to that, I think you need to have a really clear and basic understanding on what tools, systems, data you have in place, not only what you have currently in place, but also what you want to have in place. And then you need to put governance around. To do that, I think it's absolutely key to have your C-level management on board, because the cost of compliance will definitely increase. To Andrea's point, I think education on all levels or in all areas of your business need to take place. When we think of the Data Act and the Artificial Intelligence Act, it's so key that your your system developers and your IT architects are aware of what the new requirements might look like. You cannot do that by your own, and it cannot be just a task of the legal or the compliance department to make sure that your company is compliant with what comes at least out of Europe.
Alex?
Okay, one minute left. So no, I can fully endorse everything that's been said. Maybe picking up on what you said, Andrea, I think also part of the way that global organizations need to look at data protection, at data and compliance is considering whether it's a one size fits for all, or whether it also there is a trend or strategy around regional hubs. So considering different hemispheres on compliance, that might be helpful. We're seeing that sometimes as a trend for some organizations. The other point I'd make, which were touch points you raised, Raj, were also working from home. I associate that with the whole ecosystem of cybersecurity and resilience. The vulnerabilities have increased, so this is a huge challenge, both from a privacy as well as also an information security aspect. I would then finally say consent. We didn't speak about that a lot, but my experience is in the working environment, the best is to consider alternatives. So to consider other legal justifications. And conclusively, the whole, as I said also at the beginning, the whole ecosystem of regulation is evolving. It is becoming more dense. So from a strategic and a management perspective, vigilance and considering in a foresightful manner, the impact is, I think, more and more important. So having the right people in place is essential, and training enough people who get interested and involved in helping through the maze of compliance, I think, is key in going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexa. Rightfully said, so many organizations or many individuals, employees fail to understand that the privacy is a double-edged sword. I mean, you put more and more controls, but if the controls is much more intrusive, it creates much more deeper harm than a breach could potentially cause. So I think that's wonderful. I think we have time for at least one or two questions. So I will leave this question. Probably I will, read the question, and probably I will.
Now you're off on mute.
Yeah, Rajesh can't hear you.
Okay, I'm getting muted. That's fine. So
yeah.
Hopefully it's the bell that the time is off. But at least I have one question, which probably the one of the audience had sought. Do you see challenge in meeting DSR obligations where vendor tools are used by data controllers? And the logic behind is based on AI. It's a black box for data controllers. How do you see that? That's a very interesting topic, and that's basically a weapon. And I'm sure Shireen remembers this. We had a very detailed discussion in the last year's one of the topic discussions. So please, I will leave this question open for any speakers to just jump in and probably share your inputs and thoughts. Okay.
I'm still digesting. Sorry, if someone has an idea, please go ahead. I'm still digesting the question, to be honest.
Alexander, you would like to answer this?
I'm trying to put my head around it, indeed. I think if part of the question is that there is technology in place which in the nature of AI is based also on black box, and we do have a data subject request which is trying to find out what's happening, then ultimately it becomes more obfuscated of what the response to a DSR can be. The level of transparency of what type of data is actually processed for which purposes becomes a little bit more difficult. But I think in the issue with not with the question, but giving the right answer is that the nature of AI can be very difficult, right? So there is obviously stronger AI or less impactful AI, and we would need to look at that, I think, in greater detail to really give an informed answer.
Okay. One last question probably is from one of the participants. This is just a question of your views and inputs in terms of, is 4.0 with 5G technology in this, is data privacy is good, or is it still on a evolving field where we may see more rampant changes in the regulations? How are we going to cut down the chase? No answers.
Let me do one thing which builds a bit further on 5G technology. I think 5G technology itself obviously is an enabler to a much wider consorted use of data processing, personal data, non-personal data, but in particular also in the Internet of Things. And what it means is that with that technology, we are likely to have a much broader and I said, consorted use. So different controllers or different endpoints, which could be considered controllers, are involved into a 5G technology. And with that, we are entering into a sphere where we are exiting from the traditional, there's one controller, one processor relationship, but actually a multitude of controllers who are interacting. So you could say it's a big joint controllership scenario that is drawing up. I'm not yet sure that if we think about 5G technology, that the implications have been thought through of how to manage those types of ecosystems from a privacy perspective. We're seeing some scenarios where consortia are set up with terms of use and joint privacy policies. But what it means all the way through in meeting GDPR compliance, I think is yet to be seen.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much. So I would like to again take this opportunity for taking time from your busy schedules and being here and probably providing your expertise as well as many insights into terms of how some of the crucial domains are being introspected today. So thank you very much, and thanks FDPPI also as well for giving me the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.